Okay, we ramp and 3, 2. Oh, he's dead. I didn't even get to press my Arcane Cloak again. But he died in like two hits. Okay, last Arcane Cloak. Boss is gonna come out now. And then next Arcane Cloak, he dies. Promise I'm not leeching off of anything. Okay, 3, 2, 1, and he's dead. Kinda. Okay. And I'm out of mana. Good enough, I guess. 3, 2, 1, and he's dead. Just like that. Ready? He is just dead now. Watch. Uber DPS. Okay, well, he killed me. That's my Uber DPS. We would have killed him in about 10 seconds on a 1 div budget or a 25 div budget. And now we ramp, and as soon as I press the next arcane, she's dead. Ready? And she is dead. Just like that. Through 40% life and 50% life is yes. Hey everyone, it's Patch 3.23 Affliction, and today I want to talk to you about, honestly, a broken build. Today we're going to be talking about Manaforged Arrows Templar Mana Stacker, or the way I like to put this, Mana Bond with a Bow. This, in my opinion, is one of the most broken builds I've ever seen in Path of Exile, and it's just one of the most fun builds I've ever played to this date. I've absolutely fallen in love with this build, and it's been the most fun I've had in the game in quite a while. And today I want to share with you just how hilariously silly this build is. What I want to mention is everything you're going to be seeing today is about a 25 div budget. And for a 25 div budget, this build can hit almost 200 million single target DPS. But the problem here is you actually are never going to see that DPS because it takes about 4 seconds to ramp up to 200 million DPS. And by the time you do that, unfortunately, not many things actually live long enough. As you see in the B-roll, there was a Uber Exarch at some point where I did half his health before I even actually was able to fully ramp. And if he didn't phase, he would have died in 2 more seconds and would have just been deleted from the video game. And that was just on a 25 div budget. As you can see from the rest of these bosses and these delve bosses, none of the footage that you're actually seeing is my proper DPS. These bosses just are not tanky enough to be able to live this build. This build is an amazing delver. It's easily an S+ tier delver, and I would dare say it's probably the best, if not the second best current delving build in the game. And the fact that you can start this build on a 25 div budget, and personally I have gotten to 500 depth so far, which is fairly reasonably down into the mines on just a 25 div budget with no other upgrades, to me is incredible. Most builds are going to struggle to get to 500, 600, 700 on 25 divs, and the fact that this build did it so easily with no issues makes this an absolute S tier delver, an absolute S tier bosser. And because this is going to be a deep delver, it's also going to just naturally be unbelievably tanky, meaning it's going to just naturally also be a very strong bosser. So if you want to play a delver, a bosser, and eventually a pretty decent mapper, this build can really do everything. I do want to say at this budget level, your mapping experience is not going to be the best, as our mapping damage is not going to be very high, but our 200 million single target DPS is always going to be with us at all times, meaning if anything is actually somewhat tanky, we are just going to delete it off the face of the planet very quickly. Your clear is not going to be absolutely amazing until you put maybe 50, 100 div into this build. With that said, for this price budget, you can actually clear legions fairly well with it, meaning it does still overall have decent clear, and it can pretty much do all mapping content with no problems. If you were to put 100, 200 div into this build, just like you'd have to for other builds that are currently doing 8 mod, burial chambers, super high juice farming, it'd be pretty competitive at doing those maps and actually have no issues of doing them. Overall, this build is, in my opinion, just crazy for the price point that we need to put all this gear together, and it's going to scale into an absolute monster as you put 100 div into it, 200 div into it, a mirror, and so on and so forth. It's just going to scale to crazy levels, and I'm pretty sure this build can very easily do 1 to 2 billion DPS with a somewhat min-max setup. As always, with every single build that I release, my notes section is effectively a Wikipedia article on the builds that we're discussing. I would highly recommend for you to look through the notes section and see if any of this answers any of your questions. But if somehow something is missing here, feel free to ask me in the comments below. But please, please, please do take your time to actually look through the notes section. I put a lot of time and effort into it to make it as good as possible. The first thing I want to discuss is going to be how to actually start this build. Now, in my opinion, I would say you need about level 80 or so to make this feel good. I personally tried doing it at level 70 and it felt a little bit clunky and a little bit bad. But as I got to level 75, 76, and eventually to 80 and 82 to put on all my awakened gems, it felt amazing and it just started working just fine. You can start this at 70 if you really want to, but I don't recommend it. Just get yourself to 80 and you'll have a much easier time. Now, I will not be including a way to level this build, and instead what I'll be linking you is a guide on how to level. The best way to level all the way from Act 1 to Act 10, in my opinion, is going to be following Tai's Hollow Palm leveling guide. There will be a link for it in the notes section, and there will be a link for it in the description below. And you're basically going to need around 100 chaos worth of leveling gear and maybe 2 to 3 hours every time, and you should be in Act 10 very quickly. To get from Act 10 to level 80, what I recommend is to either buy a 5-ray carry, which should be enough to get you to about level 90, or to maybe get a friend to help you run some breach zones, which should get you to level 80 fairly quickly. You can also choose to just level this in any way you want on a Templar. There's many valid ways to do that. So if you have a different preferred leveling method, feel free to choose that instead of doing this with Hollow Palm. Now, next up, what I want to talk about, and I want to put this right at the beginning of the video, is how this build is actually going to work. So it's going to be fairly simple, and it's going to involve something that some people might hate, some people might love or not mind, but please bear with me and please listen to my whole explanation before you make up your mind. So this build is going to rely on Indigon. What Indigon does is every 200 mana we spend, it's going to increase the mana cost of our skills while also giving us a lot of percent spell damage. Now, this spell damage can reach up to 2000% increased spell damage, and with a medium to high-end budget setup for this build, we will be actually hitting that 2000 increased spell damage. Now, the thing is, we're playing a bow build and we're playing an attack build, and attacks don't really gain damage from spell damage. So what we're going to be doing is we are going to be shield swapping over to a Red Blade banner, and this is going to be important to not make this build feel clunky. It's going to have a Battlemage's Cry in it. Now, what Battlemage's Cry is going to do is it's going to turn all of your spell damage into attack damage at 150% of the ratio. That 2000% spell damage of Indigon is going to become 3,500 physical damage. Now, what we could do is we can run an all DH, which is going to give us 25% increased Warcry buff effect, and get Battlemage Cry buff effect on our boots, meaning that 150% effectively becomes over 200%, meaning we double the effectiveness of Indigon as attack damage. Now, the reason we are weapon swapping to do this is because we really want to run a Red Blade banner. What this does is it gives us Warcries have infinite power, and the way Warcries work is for every monster that is within the circle when you Warcry, it's going to give them a power rating. You're going to get either 1 power for normal monsters, 2 powers for magic monsters, 10 for rare, and 20 for unique monsters. Now, the thing is, we need to hit 30 power. And on a unique monster, for example, you only get 20. So that means you're losing about 33% of your damage. Or if you want to hit 30 power with a bunch of monsters around you, you need 20, 30 monsters, and well, they're going to die before they even get anywhere close to you. That's where Red Blade Banner comes into all of this. Red Blade Banner has Warcries have infinite power, meaning if I press my Warcry here with no monsters around us, it's the same thing as if there was a trillion monsters around me and I had a trillion power, meaning we're always going to get the maximum effective Battlemage's Cry. Now, as I mentioned, some people might hate this, some people might be okay with the weapon swapping, but realistically, it's not going to be that bad. On our passive tree, we're going to be picking up Potency of Will for increased skill effect duration, as well as the Mastery for 10% more skill effect duration. And we're going to be linking the Battlemage's Cry with a increased duration for more duration and an Urgent Orders. With all this combined, if you look at me run around, I'm going to press my Warcry, and as you can see, it's actually very quick. You don't get locked up in an animation for very long due to Urgent Orders giving us so much increased Warcry speed. And at the same time, our Battlemage's Cry lasts 15 seconds, making this weapon swap something you don't really have to do very often. Realistically, at the same time, the weapon swap is something you can do very fast, and something that after playing this build for maybe an hour or two will just become muscle memory and not really be that bad. As you can see, I could just attack and then just quickly weapon swap, cry, and then weapon swap back. It's something you do in less than half a second and something that you can get used to very quickly, and in my opinion, is really not that bad. One final thing I want to add to all this is that medium and high-end budget setups, you actually will do so much damage with this build that you don't actually even need to press Battlemage's Cry on anything but bosses. But on a 25 div setup like we have here, you are going to need to do this consistently to actually do enough damage. And realistically, I don't really think it's too much of an extra hassle. Next up, what I want to discuss is going to be the mapping variant of this build. So we are going to be using Rain of Arrows as saturation for everything with a faster attacks. What you can do instead to get substantially better clear in this build is going to be to use a lightning arrow with a returning projectiles. Now, this is not going to give you absolutely amazing clear, as your DPS of lightning arrow is not going to be very high, but at the same time, we are going to be still having our Storm Arena Conduit as a 6-link, which is where our 200 million DPS actually comes from, meaning anything that actually has any remote amount of health is going to have its neck snapped off really quickly, while the lightning arrows should be more than enough to get you some decent clear. Later on, with high budget, you can potentially drop things like the Elemental Focus or the lightning penetration to also fit in a fork or a pierce and maybe even a faster projectiles, giving you effectively the clear and damage of a bull build while also being substantially more tankier than a bull build could ever actually be. So as a quick TLDR for how to actually play this build, it's very, very simple. All you have to do is every 15 seconds, weapon swap over to Battlemage Cry and potentially press your Sigil of Power if you're fighting a boss. This is going to last over 30 seconds, so you only have to press this once. Then you're going to weapon swap back, press your Arcane Cloak on cooldown, and then just press as many Rain of Arrows as possible, and the rest of the build's going to play itself. So very simple. Weapon swap, cry, spam Rain of Arrows, use Arcane Cloak on cooldown. There's not much else to it. You don't need to know any of the mechanics behind how the build actually works, or how all of our ramp windows work, or why the build works the way it works. All you just need to know is simply just press Arcane Cloak and Rain of Arrows and press your cry, and you're good to go, and you do a lot of damage. Now let's start talking about the build, and the first thing I want to discuss is going to be the Ascendancy. We are going to be doing this as a Hierophant. Hierophant is going to be very important because it's going to be where we're going to be getting the majority of our defenses in this build, as Hierophant is going to give us a lot of energy shield. While you're leveling, what I recommend is to pick up Conviction of Power, as endurance and power charges are going to feel really good. And once we are max level, Conviction of Power is going to make our elemental overload a little bit more consistent, as we have power charges giving us a pretty high base crit chance, which is going to be more than enough considering the amount of attacks we're going to be doing per second is going to be very high, giving us effectively permanent elemental overload uptime. Not only that, but gives endurance charges, which are going to make you overall a little bit tankier, and it's going to mean you need a little bit less reservation to be able to put your build together. Then we're also going to be picking up Divine Guidance and Sanctuary of Thought. Divine Guidance is going to give us a lot of mana, as well as Transfiguration of Mind, which makes all of your mana increases also give you just raw generic damage. And Sanctuary of Thought is going to give 20% of your mana as extra energy shield. As you can see here, this is worth 3,000 energy shield in my current build. Now I know Path of Building says Sanctuary of Thoughts and dropping it actually technically doubles your DPS, but that is a complete lie because you will not be able to actually sustain those mana costs, and you would never actually play this build without Sanctuary of Thoughts for the increased energy shield that it gives you. Lastly, we're going to pick up Arcane Blessing, which doesn't actually do anything in our build currently, as we are running a ring that is going to turn off our mana regeneration. But later, once we drop that ring in a higher budget setup, we are going to want to have this as a way to get Arcane Surge by frostbinking around. The reason we're a Templar is not only because we have the amazing nodes of Hierophant, but eventually at a super high budget, we want to run a Flesh and Flame of Righteous Providence, which is going to allow us to start stacking Strength and Intelligence, and is going to give us 100% crit chance for free, which means we can just stack a lot of crit multi and get a lot of extra damage in this build. As for the Pantheons and the Bandits that you want to do for this build, you're going to want to kill all of your Bandits for 2 passive points. If you're a Major God, you're going to either want to run Lunaris because it's just so efficient at making you tanky, or Brine King if you are being annoyed by stuns. And you want to run Gurkthul as your Minor Pantheon because physical damage action is the only thing this build really needs. Up next, I want to discuss all the gem links in this build really quickly and to talk about what is very important here. So first off, we're going to have our Rain of Arrows setup. We want to be using Rain of Arrows of Saturation. This is a new Transfigured gem that was added with Affliction, and as we can see, if I use it in game, it's going to shoot a bunch of Rain of Arrows and then they're going to radiate out. If I'm spamming my Rain of Arrows, this effectively means we get really good coverage at all points in a large area around us. And Rain of Arrows, because it does so many small hits, is going to be how we're going to be able to sustain all the mana costs in this build due to us running a lot of instant leech, giving us a lot of instantaneous leech windows from the mana leech that we're going to be linking to it. We're also be adding in a faster attacks, as faster attacks means we can Rain of Arrows faster, giving us more leech, and it's going to make us dump mana for Indigon faster, as well as running an Elemental Focus, Laning Penetration, and Conk Effect. The reason we have these 3 specific gems in here is because they're mana cost multiplier, making Rain of Arrows cost a lot more mana. We'll also gain the benefit from Laning Penetration of this giving us exposure on hit for free. As for our main damage, we're going to be running Storm Rain of the Conduit. Now, Storm Rain is another new Transfigured gem that's added in Affliction, and it's actually really cool. So typically what Storm Rain would do is you would shoot a bunch of arrows, they would plant down, and then they would randomly shoot beams between each other. As you can see with Storm Rain of the Conduit, the beams instead are shot at you, effectively making you a conduit for all of your lightning damage. The reason we care about this and the reason it's so good is, for example, if we treat Lily as a boss, if I were to shoot a bunch of arrows over here, as you can see, all the beams are going to bounce back towards us, giving us effectively 10x the damage that we would normally get. This is substantially more consistent than Storm Rain normally is. And the nice thing about these beams is the hitbox of the beams is actually a lot bigger than they show. As you can see here, there was a beam that was kind of off to the side and didn't really look like it hit Lily, but the total hitbox of these beams are really big, which means you will always effectively have all 10 of them doing damage on a boss. This is going to be combined with a Manaforged arrows, which is going to allow us to give us free triggers of the Storm Rain while we're just spamming Rain of Arrows to generate as much mana cost as possible to make our Indigon give us a lot of damage. And we're going to be combining this with a Mirage Archer because the Mirage Archer allows us to do a lot more hits a lot faster, because as soon as Manaforged arrows triggers Storm Rain once, it also triggers Mirage Archer, which is going to make it spam a bunch of free Storm Rains. And the other crucial thing there is that they are free. Sometimes we might put ourselves in a position where we're going to be at low mana for a little bit while our mana costs are very high, meaning we actually wouldn't be able to trigger a Storm Rain due to this costing multiple thousands of mana. Well, the Mirage Archer doesn't care about that, which means we will always be throwing Storm Rains all over the place, giving us consistent DPS while mapping. We're going to also be adding in a Lightning Penetration, a Conk Effect, and an Ellie damage, just because these are both high multiplier supports, as well as high DPS supports. To support all this, we're going to be adding in an Arrogance setup with a Defiance banner, Clarity, and a Discipline. This is going to give us a lot of ES. It's going to give us Clarity, which is going to allow us to use some Watcher size mods. And Defiance banner is just a really good way of making yourself tankier by giving you a lot of reduced damage taken from crits. Then we're going to also be adding in a Grace with an Eternal Blessing. Eternal Blessing makes it so you can only have one aura reserved on your mana. That's fine because we don't want any of our mana to be reserved. And this just means we get a free aura in our build. We'll be choosing to run Grace because we have a lot of percent evasion rating in our build, making Grace a lot better overall than Determination. And then we're going to be adding in Arcane Cloak and Enhance. These can be fit wherever you have space. The Enhance is here to give the Arcane Cloak more buff effect. And the Arcane Cloak is not only going to be a very large source of our added lightning damage in this build, but it's also going to be a way for us to actually be able to dump a lot of mana. There'll be a section at the end of the video that talks more about Arcane Cloak and how this build works on a very, very detailed level if you care about it. So if you want to know more, please look at the end of the video. Then we're going to be adding in a 3-linked Manaforged arrows somewhere in our setup. This is going to be linked with a Frenzy and a Blast Rain. The Frenzy is here to give us Frenzy charges, which allows us to attack faster and give us more damage. And the Blast Rain is here because it's a high mana cost skill, meaning we can dump mana faster for Indigon. We're going to be fitting in a Frostblink wherever we have space. This is just our mobility skill and a way for us to trigger Arcane Surge through our Ascendancy. And then lastly, on our weapon swap, we're going to have a Battlemage's Cry with an increased duration in urgent orders. And in our All DE, which is our weapon for a weapon swap, we're going to have a Sigil of Power with an enhanced and increased duration. This is not going to feel too bad to use because with an increased duration and with the increased duration node that we're picking up, this Sigil of Power should last somewhere around 30 seconds, making it something that you kind of only press once on a boss and then the boss dies before you have to press it again, making it not really that bad to use. Next, let's talk about the Wildwood Ascendancy and what we want to be running with the new charms. So obviously we're going to be playing this as a Primalist. Both Warden and Warlock are just not good enough, and charms are way too broken, especially for this build. Now, there's a whole section in the notes that talks about charms and which ones you want, and all the charms in this build are pretty flexible. There's only 2 specific mods that we need, and we can realistically get these wherever we want. The 2 mods that we need is going to be 1% of Leech is instant, and you want this to be as high of a roll as possible. And you also want to get yourself a Warcry's grant rage per 5 power if you have less than 25 rage. What that does is if you are below 25 rage and you press your Warcry, you're going to get a bunch of rage. But because Red Blade Banner makes us have infinite power, that means every time we press Battlemage's Cry, we just go to 50 rage, making this a really, really strong mod to get somewhere. Now, you can get both the Leech and the Rage on a That Which Was Taken, or you can get both of these on actual charms. It doesn't really matter where you put them. Other than that, the only other mod that's going to matter here is percent of maximum mana as extra maximum energy shield. This is going to give you a lot of extra energy shield, and it's going to be where a lot of your tankiness comes from. Now, you do not need to get the exact charms out of in Path of Building. You do not need to get a Culling Strike, Leech's instant charm. These are just some sample charms on how I personally would order all my charms and where I personally put everything that I need for this build. But you do not need to get exactly this. On a budget setup, just get yourself a Leech's instant charm and then 2 charms with mana as extra ES. And then you can either find the same thing on That Which Was Taken, or get yourself Mana Leech here, or the Warcry, or just however you can fit all of this together. There's a more detailed section, notes section. If you want to know more about it, I'd recommend to read over that. Next, let's start talking about all the gear they're going to want to run this build. Now, I'm going to add the most important portion of this, and I really, really, really recommend you pay attention to this section of it. So, as I mentioned, this build and all the gear in here is going to be about 25 div. All of the gear we're using are either very garbage rare items or very common unique items that are never going to be worth a lot of money, even if this build becomes really popular. The only exception to that is going to be the Quiver. We need specifically a Poised Prism that is corrupted with +1 arrow. These are somewhere around 5 div or so, but I expect with this build becoming popular, they might spike to 10 or 15 div each, but no matter what, they will crash back down after a few days, simply due to the fact that this corrupt is not too uncommon, and this Quiver is super, super common, making getting these, especially once they become a little bit more expensive, really easy to do, meaning a lot of them will flood the market, bringing the price down. You can potentially use a crafted Quiver instead, but it's going to be substantially weaker than Poised Prism. No matter what, your Quiver has to have bows, fire, and additional arrow because we're going to be running a Widow Hail, and you need at least a 200% Widow Hail. Anything below 200% is garbage, and you need at minimum 200. Obviously, getting a little bit of a higher roll than 200 is going to be great, but you need a minimum 200 because at 200 is effectively going to give you 3 Poised Prisms, meaning the bow attacks fire additional arrow is going to become bow attacks fire 3 additional arrows, and that is going to be very important for Storm Rain because we need more additional arrows to be able to plant 10 arrows a lot faster. The reason we're running Poised Prism specifically is because we're going to be having a lot of percent physical damage from our helmet, Indigon. Because of that, any small amount of flat lightning damage we get is going to be multiplied by a lot. Not only that, but Storm Rain itself has effectively 900% effectiveness of added damage. It's 90% per arrow, but we have 10 arrows. That means this skill in this build loves added damage. Well, Poised Prism is going to give us 0 to 3 lightning damage to attacks per 10 ends, and while we have 700 intelligence in this build, and at higher budget levels, we're going to be pushing 1,500 intelligence, making this a lot of flat lightning damage. Not only that, but the Whale Hail is going to also triple that, meaning you're getting 0 to 9 lightning damage per 10 ends, which is a lot of added lightning damage. The other thing about Poised Prism is it's going to have 20 to all res on it, which is going to be tripled by Widow Hail again, giving you 60 to all res, making you get res cap in this build a lot easier. Poised Prism is just way too good, and a crafted quiver is not only going to give you less overall resistances, but it's going to be about 10 to 15% less DPS than Poised Prism, while also just overall being potentially even more expensive to find a half decent one. So that said, even if Poised Prism does go up in price, which is the only item I expect to actually raise in price from this build, it's very much recommended to buy yourself a +1 arrow one. Moving on next, our only helmet for this build is going to be an Indigon. This is the bread and butter of this build, and this is where literally all of the damage in this build comes from. The reason we want Indigon is because it's going to allow us to get a lot of percent spell damage, which I talked about in the shield swap section of this, which is then going to be multiplied and converted into physical damage through Battlemage's Cry. Ideally, what you want on your Indigon is going to be a maximum spell damage per 200 mana roll and a maximum increased mana cost of skills. If you have to make a sacrifice on the increased spell damage per 200 mana, as having 60% cost of skills is going to feel a lot better on a lower budget setup like this where we don't have a lot of attack speed. You can always upgrade this later and get yourself a double max rolled Indigon, but the rest of the stats on the helmet don't really matter too much. And if you want to get yourself a corrupt, you can find a +2 AoE corrupt to make your discipline give you a little bit more energy shield. Moving on next to our body armor, we want an ivory tower. This chestplate is going to give us a lot of mana, a lot of intelligence, and it's going to give us a little bit of energy shield per second. Now, the chaos damage taken from mana before life roll is kind of irrelevant on this chestplate because we are also going to be running a coruscating elixir, which is going to do the same thing but for energy shield. And ivory tower is not super consistent because, for example, we might have moments where we hit 0 mana or very close to 0 mana. And if we get hit by a really big chaos hit at that point, it's still just going to kill us. But we want to use this because it's just going to give us a lot of stats that we actually care about. For gloves, we're going to be running Shaper's Touch. There's no other gloves in this game that are anywhere as competitive as Shaper's Touch. Shaper's Touch is going to give us accuracy rating per 2 intelligence, which is important because we need to hit accuracy cap. It's going to give us increased evasion rating per 10 ends, meaning that a grace feels really good in this build. And as we start stacking more strength in a higher budget setup, we're also going to be gaining mana from all that strength and percent energy shield from all that strength, meaning our intelligence and our strength in this build are going to do a lot for us. What you want to find these gloves is going to be a pair corrupted with elemental weakness. These are very common and very cheap, and this is about 20% of your DPS to get yourself a curse on hit, and I would really recommend to chase down a pair of these. For boots, we're just going to be running a generic pair of stat stick boots. This is where you're going to fit a lot of your resistances. This is where you're going to get yourself some mana, some intelligence, some energy shield. Realistically, you're just going to be able to fit as many stats as you need on here, but the biggest priority is going to be a lot of movement speed and to get any resistances you need. There is a section in the notes about boots, and there's a trade link here if you want to buy yourself a pair of boots. I really wouldn't recommend crafting your own pair of boots, as boots like this are pretty cheap due to mana not really being a stat people value on boots and on gear in general, except we really care about it in this build. And you want to put Battlemage's Cry buff effect and increase action speed as your 2 Eldritch Implicits. For our amulets, the only really good budget amulet in this build is going to be its Theory's Foible. This is a very cheap amulet as it's not used in any build right now that gives you a lot of percent mana and a lot of flat mana. And what I'd really recommend is to make sure you Fertile Catalyst it, as this is going to give you 20% more mana modifiers, meaning you get 20 extra flat mana and 4% increased maximum mana. Another really cute thing about this is the items and gems have 25% reduced attribute requirements. That is actually kind of relevant here, as we need 155 dexterity, and with this on we only need about 120, meaning one singular dexterity roll on a ring, for example, is enough to get us all of the attributes that we might be missing in this build. As for an anoint, Primal Spirit's the only real good anoint here. It's also super cheap. It's maybe a chaos at most, and it's going to be the anoint you want to run at all times in this build. For rings, we are going to be running a rare ring, and this is just again a stat stick just like the boots. You want to make sure you get yourself a dexterity roll here, and you want to get a very high tier dexterity roll, as it's going to take care of your dexterity problems, and then just fill it with resistances, fill it with ES, with mana, with int, whatever you can fit in here, whatever is in your budget. There is a link in the notes section for rings as well to get yourself one. For our other ring, we'll be running a Shav's Revelation. Now, this is a really good budget ring for this build, not only because it has a lot of flat intelligence, but it's also going to give us 300 raw mana when we use a Fertile Catalyst on it, as well as 6% energy shield per second, which is a lot of ES regen. It's going to make you feel really, really tanky when you add it with the ES leech I have in this build. Now, you really want to make sure you put your shafts in your right socket. If you put in your left socket, you're not going to gain any of the mana benefits, but instead you're not going to gain the insane amount of flat mana, but instead you're going to get a lot of ES, and you really do not want to do that. The only downside of this ring is it will make it so you cannot regenerate mana. That's really not a problem. Our mana regen isn't that high, especially when we compare it to all of the mana leech that we have in this build, meaning we can play the build just fine and you really will not notice any sort of difference. You might run into a situation where you run out of mana if there's nothing around you to kill, but you will just randomly auto attack if you don't have enough mana for Rain of Arrows. And as soon as you auto attack once, your mana leech will kick in and then you'll be able to immediately be able to attack again. The other thing as well, which will save you from that awkward moment, is we are going to be taking the 10% of damage is recouped as mana. So as soon as you take one hit, your mana will be fixed. But this situation where you have no mana and you don't have enough mana to cast one Rain of Arrows, it's very, very uncommon and you really won't have to worry about it too much. As for our builds, we're going to just be running a Stygian, and what we want to do as a Stygian is we want to get one that has Chance to Avoid being shocked on it. This is because we're going to be combining that with an Abyss Jewel with Chance to Avoid being shocked on it as well, to give us 100% chance to avoid being shocked, to have Ailment immunity when we combine that with a Storm Shroud, which is going to turn our Chance to Avoid being shocked into Chance to Avoid everything. Now, there will be a trade link in the notes section if you want to buy yourself one of these, but the thing to keep in mind here is you want to look at the chance to avoid being shocked roll on your belt, and you want to get a roll on your Abyss Jewel that is going to bring you to 100%. You do not need to get yourself a max roll on your Abyss Jewel unless your belt is only 50%, but if you buy yourself, for example, a belt like this, which is 53%, you'd only need 47% on your jewel. That's important because if you tried to look for a 50% chance to avoid being shocked jewel, as you can see, there's only 22 results currently online. If I were to change the 50% to something like 47%, because I have 53% on my belt, as you can see, we can now see 144 different jewels. The higher of a roll you find on your belts, the easier it'll be to find a matching jewel to add onto all this. But other than that, what you want to find on your belt on your jewel is just going to be flat mana, any resistances you can fit in, and potentially a little bit of energy shield. Realistically, just use this to get yourself res capped. And if you can get mana and energy shield, that's great. If you can't, that's completely fine as well. Moving on next to our flasks. Our flasks are going to be very, very simple. First, we're going to be running a coruscating elixir. Not only is this a ruby flask, meaning we're going to be taking a lot less fire damage from all the attacks that go against us, but it's also going to make it so chaos damage is going to go through our energy shield before hitting our life. That means the clunky potential moments of Ivory Tower are going to be completely negated, and it's going to make the build feel super comfy. Now, one thing to mention here is this will not be active on bosses. That's going to be completely okay, as none of the bosses really do chaos damage, and you're realistically not going to put yourself in a position where you don't have any mana, meaning that Ivory Tower will be able to tank the chaos damage for you through mana instead of tanking through energy shield or through your life. Outside of bossing, this should have 100% uptime everywhere else due to its duration being very long, so it should be more than consistent with no way of generating extra flash charges. To pair that, we also want to run a Sapphire and a Topaz flask. This is just to give us a lot of elemental damage reduction, as that's all we really care about in this build, and it's the only thing that's going to really kill us. We also want to add in a Quicksilver and a Jade. You can replace a Jade flask with a Quartz flask instead if you want permanent phasing. That's also a good option if you don't really care about having a little bit more evasion. Now, for all these, personally, what I found to be pretty good as a prefix is to run the 3 charges when you're hit by an enemy, as you do get hit with this build quite a lot. We could also simply choose to run either increased duration or to run the increased effect reduced duration prefix. And for suffixes, what we want to run is movement speed, attack speed, evasion rating, and the crafted 3% of life is regenerated per second. This is going to be turned into ES regen because we have Zealot's Oath, and you just simply put this on whatever flask you want. Moving on next, let's talk about the clusters that we want in this build. So we're going to want 2 identical large 8 passive clusters. These are going to be very simple. We just want to get ourselves Scintillating Idea, Disorienting Display, and Stormdrinker. Now, I expect these to go up in price because I mentioned this specific set, so what you can instead do is find any other suffix other than Disorienting Display. As long as you have Scintillating Idea and Stormdrinker, that's all you really need. And even if Scintillating Idea is very expensive, you realistically just need Stormdrinker to get yourself ES Leech. But if Stormdrinker, Scintillating, Disorienting is too expensive, you can replace the Disorienting with either Doriani's Lesson or Widespread Destruction. We're just simply going to be putting 2 of these at the top of our tree, and we're just going to be shoving in a bunch of jewels into them, as there's no other medium and small jewels that we currently want to fit into this build. To add on to that, there's going to be quite a lot of different unique jewels that we want to fit into our build. First, we're going to be wanting to run a Watcher's Eye. Now, the only mod they're going to want to run on this is going to be maximum mana as extra maximum energy shield while affected by Clarity. This is going to give you a lot of extra ES, as well as Watcher's Eye itself giving you % ES and % mana, making this an overall really strong jewel. We're then going to also want to add that which was taken, which I talked about in the charm section. This is simply just going to have any of the charm modifiers that I mentioned at the top of the notes section, and you just choose to mix and match this as much as you want with whatever stats you can find on it. We're going to be also adding in a Storm Shroud. This is going to give us our Ailment immunity. We're going to be adding in a Healthy Mind by melding And the reason we want to do this is because it's going to turn all the percent life into percent mana at 200% effectiveness, as well as melding just being a really good point in terms of giving us a lot of energy shield. And lastly, for the unique jewels, we are going to be adding in an Unnatural Instinct on the right side of the Scion starting area. And this is going to give us a bunch of accuracy rating, some attack speed, and a little bit of spell damage and some movement speed, making this a really, really strong jewel overall. You're going to really want to make sure you get this because the reason we really care about this is these accuracy rating nodes over here, as getting to accuracy cap in this build is a little bit painful to do. Speaking of accuracy rating cap, a really easy way for you to get closer to accuracy rating cap before you have more intelligence for Shaper's Touch to take care of most of it for you is by adding in a bunch of accuracy rating fish jewels in some of your empty sockets. You can very easily find high accuracy rating, high flat mana abyss jewels for pretty cheap, and adding in two of these with a high enough roll should almost effectively get you to 100% hit chance. For the last few remaining sockets, all you want to do is just simply add in a Corrupting Blood jewel wherever you can fit it, as well as just generic percent mana, percent energy shield jewels wherever you can. And if you cannot fit in a Poised Prism or you are not res capped yet, you can choose to just find either percent mana or percent energy shield and then choose to get a bunch of resistances on your suffixes, which should make these jewels fairly cheap to purchase. And that's all there really is to say about this build. Now, I did mention that there is going to be an addendum to this guide, and we are now going to very quickly go over a very important concept for the people that want to know more about this build. We are going to be talking about how this build works and how the ramp for this build actually works if you want to know the nitty-gritty of this build and the way it's going to function. So as you saw in the B-roll, I had to ramp up for a few seconds, and then as soon as I ramped, the bosses just immediately died. I drew this picture on my stream, and a lot of people found it very useful, so I'm going to include it here and talk about it just to use as a visual representation of what is actually happening in this build. So this build is going to have 4-second windows. You're going to have a 4-second ramp up when you first begin combat, and then afterwards you're going to be working in 4-second burst windows where you are effectively doing consistent damage, but at the start of every 4 seconds, you are going to do substantially more damage for a second or two. So this build is going to be relying on using Arcane Cloak as a way for us to dump a lot of mana. As we discussed, we are a Indigon build, and we want to not only dump a lot of mana to increase our mana cost of skills so we can dump mana faster, but to also gain all of that spell damage from dumping so much mana to then turn to physical damage through our Battlemage's Cry. Now, if I just sit here and spam Storm Rain, as you can see, it's currently a 14 mana cost. If I start spamming it, as you can see, it'll very slowly go up in price. 22 and eventually go to 30 something, and then it'll go to like 44 something, but it's going to ramp very slowly, which means we are not really going to gain that much extra mana for Indigon. Instead, what we can do is if I'm going to press Arcane Cloak, this is going to eat up 65% of my mana. And as you can see, Rain of Arrows is going to go from 14 mana cost all the way up to 250. As you can see at 250, it's going to ramp a lot faster. Now, as you saw there, after a few seconds, it went from 300 something to 150. And that was because 4 seconds passed, which means the 65% of our mana that Arcane Cloak ate up and added into Indigon's mana cost of skills recently went away. That's completely okay. As we can see here in this first chart, all we want to do is immediately press Arcane Cloak and then spam as many Rain of Arrows as we can. If you look at this chart, this bottom dark line here is the mana ramping of Rain of Arrows if we don't press Arcane Cloak. As you can see, it's very, very slow. But if you press Arcane Cloak, as you can see, we immediately jump up quite a lot of extra mana, making our ramp go by a lot faster. Now, what's going to happen after 4 seconds, as you saw, is the mana recently from the Arcane Cloak is going to go away, but our overall Rain of Arrows mana cost is still going to stay very high. So 4 seconds later, instead of starting down here at this green line as our base Rain of Arrows mana cost, we're now going to be starting somewhere around here. And as soon as our Arcane Cloak is back up, we are going to press it, which is going to do what it did in the past 4 seconds, where it's going to effectively jump us a bunch of mana costs, but it's going to do it again because instead of Rain of Arrows being 14 mana and being down here in terms of mana cost, it was already halfway up this chart, meaning it's going to be picked up all the way to the top. And as we can see, if we follow the green line, that means we're effectively starting this build, and now our ramp is basically at the top of the chart. As you can see, the damage is just going to go berserk, and it's just going to go off the chart, and it's going to go to a very high level. Now, this is the burst that you saw in all the B-roll. It was just simply this massive jump in mana cost, where my Rain of Arrows goes from costing 150 all the way up to 300 instantly. And then since at 300, it's going to scale very quickly up to 900, right? So we are going to build up to 350, 400. My Rain of Arrows is going to go away. Pretend I had mana. We press Arcane Cloak again. This jumps all the way up to 700 mana cost, and then we're going to keep ramping it from there. And our instant leech is going to allow us to actually be able to deal with all this, as our damage is going to be very high, meaning we're going to have very big leech windows. And because we're instantaneously leeching 19% of that, we are basically going to be filling our mana bar almost instantly, effectively allowing us to dump anywhere between 7 to 8,000 mana a second very easily, and capping out Indigon's increased spell damage, which then gets turn into a lot of physical damage. None of this is really important to know. You don't need to know any of this to play the build, but I did want to explain this for the people who are curious on exactly why this build has a 4-second ramp and why our damage just goes absolutely nuclear as soon as I press the second Arcane Cloak. You don't need any of this, and realistically, just pressing Arcane Cloak once and just spamming your Rain of Arrows is already enough damage to kill everything. And I really can't even show you the second half of this picture because everything doesn't have enough health to actually reach even halfway up this chart before it just falls over and dies due to this build just doing too much damage. That's all I have to say for this guide. I hope you cuties enjoyed. I hope you cuties have fun with this build. I am having so much fun with it. I'm having fun delving, and I'm excited to do some mapping, and I'm excited to do some bosses with this build and to just enjoy it as a build this league because this is just way too fun to not play for at least the next little bit. In the upcoming days, I will talk about a more mid/end game setup for this build and how to eventually swap over to the attribute stacking version of this build, which is going to be the version that's going to be able to hit billions of DPS quite easily. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment in the description below. I'll be more than happy to answer it as soon as I can. I also stream on Twitch every single day, so if you want to see this build in action for yourself, feel free to come by and ask your questions there if you have any, or just feel free to join some of the cuties and have fun with all of us on Twitch. Other than that, I hope you cuties have a wonderful rest of your day. I'll see you cuties in the next video.